Hello, and welcome to CRPS Contender, my complex regional pain syndrome education channel. Today we are continuing in our journal journey with the paper Neuropsychological Changes in CRPS. This is part 2, talking about deficits in lateralized spatial cognition. This is definitely going to be the longest video in this series for this paper. Let's do a quick refresher. This paper was published in January of 2020 in Chronic Pain Hurts the Brain, the Pain Physician's Perspective. And this is from the abstract. CRPS is a poorly understood chronic pain condition of multifactorial origin. CRPS involves sensory, motor, and autonomic symptoms, as well as reduced attention to CRPS-affected extremities, reminiscent of hemispatial neglect. However, this neglect-like framework is not sufficient to characterize the range of higher cognitive functions that can be altered in CRPS. This comprehensive literature review synthesizes evidence of neuropsychological changes in CRPS in the context of potential central mechanisms of the disorder, constituting 3 distinct but not independent groups: distorted body representation, deficits in lateralized spatial cognition, and impairments of non-spatially lateralized higher cognitive functions, consistent with the broader disruption to parietal function beyond merely what could be considered neglect-like. And today we will be focusing on the second of these 3 groups, deficits in lateralized spatial cognition. Let's do a quick introduction here. Hemispatial neglect is reduced awareness of stimuli on one side of space, even though there may be no sensory loss. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that despite the absence of any brain lesions, people with CRPS can present with neuropsychological symptoms. In this article, the authors provide a comprehensive critical review of the evidence for altered neuropsychological functions in CRPS. They end up concluding that the currently used neglect-like framework is insufficient for characterizing the variety of neuropsychological changes shown. Many people with CRPS report symptoms resembling hemispatial neglect syndrome that can follow a brain lesion. Neglect is an attentional deficit in sensation, movements, and/or body representations of the contralesional side of the body and/or space that cannot be completely attributed to sensory or motor loss. The unilateral nature of CRPS, meaning usually on one side of the body, means that we could expect any cognitive deficits to be predominantly associated with the activity of the hemisphere on the opposite side to the painful side. Thus far, the evidence for such lateralized manifestations of neuropsychological symptoms in CRPS is not straightforward. I want you to remember that throughout the rest of this because there are some conflicting reports here, so know that going forward. In CRPS, there is observed motor neglect, specifically slower movement initiation, slower movement execution, undershooting the goal of reaching an object in space, and a decreased range of movement performed with the CRPS-affected limb. There are further signs of motor neglect in CRPS patients, as patients report a need for directed attention to move the affected limb and the occurrence of involuntary movements. The authors argue that these symptoms more closely resemble body representation distortion than hemispatial neglect. Between 17 and 90% of patients with CRPS report these motor and/or cognitive neglect-like symptoms. The frequency and severity of these self-reported symptoms appears to be greater in CRPS than in other pain conditions. Based on this clinical and self-reported evidence, it could be argued that people with CRPS present with neuropsychological deficits that resemble hemispatial neglect and related syndromes of body awareness, such as loss of ownership, and feelings of dislike or hatred of the affected limb. Overall, though, the performance of people with CRPS on confrontation testing and standard neuropsychological tests does not provide sufficient support for the hypothesis that CRPS involves the neglect of the affected limb or side of space. Some findings even suggest the opposite direction of spatial bias, or exaggerated pseudo-neglect. Another possibility is that the classic neglect tests are not sufficiently sensitive to reveal the subtle neuropsychological changes in CRPS, as they are more likely to develop because of less overt structural and/or functional changes, and not brain lesions. Through the following more sensitive tests, researchers have found evidence for biases in people with CRPS in the following domains of spatial cognition: of knowing where you are in space, The egocentric frame of reference, in which objects are represented relative to the perceiver. Tactile spatial attention in the personal space, which is where your body is directly. Visual spatial attention in the personal and peripersonal space. Peripersonal space is when you stick your arms out, kind of what you can touch in that circumference. And the internal representation of space, and spatially defined motor control. Here is the first test, the subjective body midline. People with CRPS demonstrated a deviation of subjective body midline towards the affected side of space when judged in a darkened room. However, under illuminated conditions, there was no bias in the body midline when the patient was able to make use of the allocentric frame of reference, or when they were basing things on external cues instead of in relation to themselves. This suggests that if people with CRPS have a distorted subjective body midline, it affects only the representation of external space in relation to their own body. Spatial bias of egocentric frame of reference in relation to the self towards the affected side is consistent with an overrepresentation of the affected side relative to the unaffected side of space. Patients with CRPS made subjective body midline judgments that were biased further to the left, irrespective of which side of the body was affected. This pattern can be interpreted as exaggerated pseudo-neglect, and it suggests that people with CRPS can have problems with combining external visual information with their own subjective body midline. On the other hand, other authors have demonstrated that people with CRPS showed no bias when judging their body midline, using a visual straight-ahead task. It appears that any shift of egocentric frame of reference are subject to high individual variability because these effects do not always replicate. Another of the sensitive measures that were used was temporal order judgment, or which thing came first in time. According to the law of prior entry, attended stimuli are perceived before unattended ones. This principle forms the basis for temporal order judgment tasks. CRPS patients exhibited reduced attention to touch stimulation when applied to the affected limb. When the limbs were crossed, their performance indicated inattention to the unaffected hand, which was now located in the affected side of space. They exhibited the same pattern of attention bias, both with and without visual feedback about the limb's position. The authors concluded that visual attention bias is space-based because it was observed regardless of involvement from the body. This suggests that people with CRPS had a deviation in attention both away from the affected side and away from the affected limb, regardless of where that limb was located. These deficits do not seem to affect all aspects of visual spatial attention. They indicate that judgments of subjective body midline are biased towards the affected side, that is, in the direction opposite to what would be expected based on their self-reported neglect of the affected limb. Yet temporal order judgments of tactile and visual stimuli tend to be systematically biased away from the affected side of space, and problems with attention allocation cannot explain this bias. Given that the visual and tactile temporal order judgments were affected, attention biases in CRPS might be supramodal, meaning going beyond the senses. Another sensitive measure was the mental number line bisection. Midpoint number judgments in CRPS were found to deviate away from the affected side, suggesting that inattention to the affected side of personal and peripersonal space exhibited by people with CRPS also affects the internal representation of space. Biased mental number line bisection suggests a generalized distortion of spatial representations in CRPS, which could potentially occur via higher order mechanisms. Another sensitive measure was spatially defined motor control. Contrary to the motor neglect hypothesis, people with CRPS did not show any signs of neglect or extinction on behavioral motor tasks. Similarly, there was no asymmetry in hand movement patterns measuring motor accuracy, meaning these appear to be spatially defined motor deficits in CRPS, that is, deficits that are modulated by where the movements are performed relative to the body midline. The findings of this study are consistent with the self-reported neglect-like symptoms, which primarily entail movement difficulties. However, another perspective that the authors will now outline is that motor deficits in CRPS arise from decreased use of the limb rather than attention bias. The proposed hypothesis is a learning-based account for motor deficits in CRPS, framed as non-use of the affected limb. Learned non-use manifests as motor difficulties greater than expected based on actual physical constraints, or as a difference between what the patient can do spontaneously and what they are able to do in a clinical examination. This could explain why motor neglect-like symptoms are reported by people with CRPS, but not necessarily apparent upon experimental testing. It is argued that in CRPS, learned non-use is normally limb-specific rather than involving one half of the body and could manifest in protective behaviors. Movement is suppressed by immobilization, pain, and fear avoidance behaviors. At the same time, compensatory movements of the unaffected limb are developed and reinforced. These changes can alter cognitive and cortical representations of the CRPS-affected limb. Primary somatosensory and motor cortical representations of the affected hand were found to be smaller, consistent with underutilization, while the sensory map of the unaffected hand was found to be enlarged, consistent with compensatory use. Attention-based and learning-based explanations are not mutually exclusive, and some changes in motor control in CRPS could arise from a combination of both of these factors. That was a lot of information, and I know I didn't break it down a ton because I'm trying to keep it shorter. So let's talk about the summary of what changes are happening here. Research suggests that people with CRPS might present with neuropsychological deficits resembling hemispatial neglect that follows a stroke. However, the evidence for this is not consistent, as demonstrated by the two following points. Sensitive tests for perceptual and representational changes have revealed lateralized deficits in spatial cognition, consistent with a bias away from the CRPS-affected side of the body or space. On the contrary, other findings from visual subjective midline judgments point to a shift of in relation to the self frame of reference towards the affected side in CRPS, thus in the direction opposite to what would be expected for neglect of the affected side. The opposing biases away from the affected side of space in temporal order judgment tasks and towards the affected side of space in visual subjective body midline tasks cannot be explained by the different modalities that were tested in these tasks, because the temporal order judgment tasks were biased in the visual domain. There are two possible explanations to consider for these opposing biases: the dissociation between near and far regions of space, and the distinct functional aspect of the peripersonal space, which is defensive and goal-oriented. So the first one, the different regions of space in which the participants performed the temporal order judgments and the subjective body midline judgments could potentially account for these inconsistencies. But the one they are more interested in is 2, defensive versus goal-directed space. Peripersonal space, which is where you stick your arms out and what you can touch, basically, is thought to dissociate into 2 different representations according to 2 distinct functions: preparing for defensive responses and preparing for actions, which is goal-directed. Peripersonal space cannot be defined in terms of fixed boundaries around the body or a body part, but its extent is rather graded and dynamically changing according to the action being performed and the proximity or subjective importance of the external information provided. The authors speculate that different dynamic changes to goal-directed and defensive peripersonal space specific to the affected extremity might explain these contrasting biases. The reduced activity of the affected limb, resulting in fewer interactions with the affected side of goal-directed peripersonal space, could reduce visuospatial processing near the body in the affected side compared to the unaffected side. The authors suggest that the dimensions of the affected side's defensive peripersonal space could be enlarged due to a heightened sense of hypervigilance to threat. This heightened defensive awareness to stimuli that are potentially threatening to a CRPS-affected limb due to allodynia and hyperalgesia could drive a bias towards the affected side in extrapersonal space, which is even larger than the peripersonal space. An enlarged defensive, yet diminished goal-directed peripersonal space representation of the affected side could still account for the seemingly contradictory findings of attention bias. These findings suggest that CRPS is associated with contrasting alterations in spatial attention, representations of space, and spatially defined motor control. The neuropsychological changes in these domains are observed in different modalities such as visual and touch, and different regions of space such as personal, peripersonal, extrapersonal, and representational. These contrasting patterns of performance in spatial tasks could be explained by hypervigilance to approaching stimuli within the affected side of extrapersonal space or defensive peripersonal space, while the simultaneous neglect to the affected side of personal and goal-directed peripersonal space stemming from learned non-use. The somatosensory, motor, and body representation distortions are largely confined to the CRPS-affected limb. There is a hypothesis called somatospatial inattention. Some spatial biases might only manifest when the body is directly involved in the task at hand, demonstrating an overlap of cognitive changes in body representation and spatial attention. It is proposed that the disruption of spatial processing in CRPS specifically involves problems with integrating spatial information with body representation. This phenomenon is called somatospatial inattention. The authors found a significant attention bias in visual temporal order judgments only when the patient's hands were positioned close to the visual stimuli in near space, but not when the hands were out of sight. The deviated visual subjective body midline in CRPS is also somewhat in agreement with this somatospatial inattention hypothesis, since this measure requires integrating the body midline with external visual spatial frame of reference. The performance of people with CRPS is consistent with an overrepresentation of the affected side, rather than inattention. The proposed somatospatial inattention, however, does not fully account for all spatial attention biases found in CRPS, because significant deviation away from the affected side was also observed in visual temporal order judgment tasks for stimuli that did not involve and were not near to any affected body parts. The proposed mechanisms of interactions between bodily and spatial representations suggests that there are two hypothetical mechanisms through which body representation disturbance might drive attentional biases, even when these body parts are not directly involved in spatial tasks: reduced sense of ownership and an increased perceived size of the CRPS-affected limb. Or more generally, the body representation forms the basis for spatial cognition. A reduced sense of awareness and a reduced sense of ownership of the painful limb could contribute to this inattention, and the perceived increase of size of the affected extremity could conversely drive hyperattention. Peripheral CRPS symptoms might offer additional explanation of how body-related disturbances could drive attentional biases. First, there is exaggerated, painful somatosensory input. This leads to sensory gains and sensory loss due to suppression of some types of somatosensory input. This leads to mechanical constraints of motor symptoms caused by underutilization and learned non-use, leading to space-based inattention due to asymmetry in spatial representations of the body. Therefore, the peripheral, somatosensory, and motor mechanisms, as well as the central mechanisms of body representation, could serve as complementary explanations for how body-related information could exacerbate spatial biases, even when that information is not directly relevant to the task. I am working very hard to keep this video under 20 minutes, so we will pick this right back up in part 3. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to read the paper yourself or see the notes or see the slides, they're linked in the description. If you'd like to contribute to my living expenses, my Patreon is linked. Thank you so much to my faithful patron, Chase and Emily Malcontent. I hope you guys learned something today, and I hope to see you next time.